Hey everyone, welcome to my philosophy channel, Ideation, where we speak about the nature of reality, consciousness, metaphysics, and we do deep dives into those topics. When I'm not philosophizing about the arcane and the esoteric, I'm writing, and you can find links to my published poems in the description. And if I'm not writing, then I'm rapping, and my EP, Thálatta will be released on the 30th of July, so stay tuned for that. Again, you'll find a link to my music channel in the description. Thank you.
Ride dirty is the fucking sky that you praying to. If it brings me to my knees, it's a bad religion.
So today we'll be talking about why I am no longer an atheist. This video isn't really meant to convince anyone, it's just kind of sketching my trajectory from a militant atheist to where I am now, because it kind of took me by surprise as well, and I wasn't sure what were the guideposts that led me to where I am, and so I thought it would be interesting to chart through my history of experiences and philosophical ideas and show why I'm no longer an atheist. Before we start, I think we should take heed of a great quote by John Vervaeke, which reads, a lot of what you think is natural to you, just part of how your mind works, is actually culturally internalized. It has been generated historically, and you have internalized it culturally. Very sage words, and I think it's a good sort of framing for this because, yeah, we do tend to internalize cultural beliefs almost as facts without realizing that we're doing so. So yes, let us begin. Okay, godless prepubescence. So I grew up in a Christian family. We went to church every Sunday, Sunday school, pray before you eat your meals. So it was very sort of infused with my day-to-day life. But I remember from a young age, from being about 10, I was like having doubts. Like I remember after we had communion and you're supposed to go do like a silent prayer. I got my communion, I sat down and I sort of prayed to God like, hey, listen, I don't believe in you right now, but I'm 10 and all these adults do, so, I'm probably wrong. So if you could just give me a sign, that would be, that'd be great. And I never received that sign. Although this was sort of like a latent atheism or maybe tepid. It wasn't really like a strong part of my identity. I didn't really care about it that much. And so this was sort of before my militant atheism phase. I remember seeing these ages in the Bible that just seemed absurd. Like people are saying like this guy lived to 900 years old to 700 years old. And I was like, that can't be right. So I'd ask, I remember I asked the family, did these guys really live to that age? And they kind of hedged it a little bit and found a way to kind of say yes, but not really. And so that was me. I just sort of doubted that completely. I didn't think that was feasible. And another thing that I sort of recall, which I think is a good piece of the puzzle to this, was my severe death anxiety as a child. I remember I would be like 10 years old and I would think to myself, I'm 10 now and I'll be 11 next year, I'll be 12 next year, I'll be 13, and I iterated that, and then one day I'll be dead. And they're like, okay, but then I'll be dead for 1 year, then I'll be dead for 2 years, then I'll be dead. And I did that, and I suddenly kind of got this impression of a terrifying black infinity of nothingness. And I just get this like weird feeling in my chest, like a tight feeling, and I'd have to kind of like push myself out and just not think about it anymore, because it was just so terrifying to me to contemplate this sort of infinite non-existence. So yes, when I became an adolescent, that's sort of when I really sort of came into my own as an atheist, and it really started forming a core part of my identity, although this was sort of in my later phases, like around 17, 18 years old. Before that, I was having some strange experiences. Like we moved from England to Cape Town when I was around 12, 13. And I remember there's very specific moments in Cape Town where it's like the best way I could sort of put it is that I fell into my body. I kind of realize that I'm like a public entity and like I really exist and I'm out here. And I did know that before I was 13, obviously, but it wasn't or emblazoned onto my brain. And so I remember having this very specific feeling of when I was around 13. I fell into my body and I really became conscious of myself. And I remember because I started caring about how I dressed and like started feeling self-conscious about all of that. And I was sort of kind of new. I was always a very, my head was in the clouds a lot as a child. And I didn't have the language to describe this before, but Formscapes, which is a channel on YouTube, and I think he's great. He talks about John Gebser and all of these guys, and he basically speaks about how our subjectivity is structured differently as we evolve. And so he kind of gave me the language for that, because then it made me realize like, oh, I think that was just like a switch in the structure of my subjectivity where I've sort of fell into this place. But yeah, no, I would recommend Formscapes video. So around 15, 16, I think that's when it like the inklings of my atheism started to bear fruit. But I do want to distinguish between atheism generally and atheo-materialism / physicalism. Atheism in general, I want to make that distinction because, you know, you can be an atheist and still believe in ghosts or still believe in the afterlife. However, an atheo-materialist has their atheism typically based on the ontology of physicalism, right? That the world is made out of physical stuff. And that is typically allied with the rejection of anything supernatural, right? Ghosts, spirits, afterlife, anything like that is sort of rejected. So I want to make that distinction. And yeah, I mean, where I am now is very different from where I was before. I'm a lot more open to anomalous phenomena. And I imagine, you know, if I went back and talked to my like 18, 19-year-old self, he'd be so disappointed in me, right? Like if there's woo, right? Like woo is typically a sort of pejorative or negative term used to describe anything supernatural, or like things like telepathy or mediumship, you know, talking to the dead and things like that. And so if I was telling him about this, you know, his woodometer, so to speak, which, you know, I was measuring, it would just be going off the charts, you know, and that's that's my little woodometer. Although actually that is I read these books, the first books I read when I was younger, like 13. I remember the first book that really made me fall in love with reading was His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. And in the first book, there was this instrument called the alethiometer, and if you ask it a question, it'll kind of tell you the truth. So I'm just kind of repurposing it for you know, these things. But yeah, if I told my 19-year-old self what I believe now, the woodometer would be beeping. It would be like Chernobyl, you know. And funnily enough, actually, His Dark Materials, like, it is a trilogy of books, and I read them, you know, voraciously. And after I read them, I asked my mom if I could go see the movie because I saw it was coming out. So she's like, sure, let me just look into it. And she came back to me and she's like, that these books are like very anti-religious, very heavily against God. And somehow I didn't pick that up. And like, as she said it, I started replaying the whole book in my head, the 3 books in my head. And I was like, oh yeah, these are actually very, and they were very anti-religious books, you know, because I think Philip Pullman is an atheist. Okay, and now we're gonna sort of move on to the more phenomenological side of things, where I'm sort of describing experiences I had that conditioned my receptivity to certain ideas, right? You start with experience, and that has relevance to your metaphysical speculations, right? Because I think what most metaphysics are, or all of them really is, they're just elaborations, conceptual and sort of rigorous elaborations of intuition. And, you know, just for example, if you know, you saw a ghost or like some pale figure when you were 9 years old, and then 20 years later you hear a theory that says ghosts exist, you'll be much more receptive to that because of your experience versus if you hadn't seen a ghost. And so that's sort of the relevance of bringing these experiences in, which always felt, quote unquote spiritual. Like that was the word that I always sort of leapt to. Yeah, as I mentioned before, I was always a very head in the clouds sort of child, just kind of floating in a land of thought. And it always sort of felt like it took precedence over my fleshly body, and so I was always very stuck in my head and enamored with the interior, right? Let's say. I kind of described it like it always felt like my mind was in these like alien, strange waters, with like weird creatures and it wasn't disturbing, but it was fascinating and it definitely felt somewhat anomalous. And yeah, this is the question. When I was 18 to about 23, 24, I sort of suffered from derealization, right? Where I felt like the world wasn't real, and also depersonalization. I felt like I wasn't real. I'd always have these like looping existential thoughts that were very destabilizing and sort of terrifying, where everything would feel like a dream, and I'd get this like panicky feeling in my chest when I could feel myself sort of retracting away from the solidity of a situation, and it sort of started feeling like it was all a dream. But the flip side of that is that actually, I got interested in like the Upanishads and sort of what the ancient Hindus thought, and they had this notion, right, that you have the world of Maya, and that is just like our sensory world of multiplicity and distinction and solidity. And then you had Atman, which was like your innermost self, and you had Brahman, which was the essence of the universe. And for them, enlightenment was seeing through the veil of Maya, right? Seeing past sensory objects and realizing that Atman is Brahman, realizing that your innermost self is actually connected and is in some sense identical to the essence of the universe. And so we are in some sense in Brahman's dream, right? And it was uncanny to me when I started reading this because it lined up so well, firstly with the derealization experience I was having, that it kind of felt like though it might have been spontaneous, incipient sparks of sort of this realization. And it confused me how these people in the 7th century BCE could write something that seemed so uncannily applicable to what I was going through. And so I always sort of found that interesting. But I do also kind of want to make it clear that, derealization and depersonalization, they're in the DSM, and if you find that they're sort of clouding your ability to function, then it's not, don't think that you're going down like a spiritual rabbit hole and you're sort of seeing things as they are. It does get confusing though, of course, because the symptoms of derealization and enlightenment, right? Like derealization is feeling that the world isn't real, and enlightenment, part of it is like seeing through the veil of Maya, right? And so those are kind of analogous, and so it's hard to tease them apart. But I do want to caution against sort of validating what can be very distressing to some people. Like Kurt Jamangal, he has this theories of everything channel, and I know that he went through something very similar, where he was studying all these theories about consciousness and pondering existence and wondering what it all means, and he got these like very scary and destabilizing moments of unreality where it's very hard to describe if you haven't experienced it, but it's like it can give you a feeling of dread and almost panic, where you can feel like the solidity of the world is slipping away from you. And so it is a sort of risk, if you're going to wade into the waters of like existence and consciousness and trying to see how all these things relate. And so I'm a writer primarily. I finished my novel, and it's in the query trenches right now. I'm trying to find a literary agent, and I've had a couple of poems published, and so I've always had a very intimate relationship with creativity, and it always, to me, felt like I was collaborating with an otherness. Right, there was just this thing out there, and it was giving me these ideas, and we'd sort of work on it together. But the ideas always felt like they were coming from somewhere else. Like it wasn't really me who created the ideas. I just sort of perceived them. Although I don't want to say that I played no role in it. So it's a collaboration, right? The raw materials of the idea sort of get dumped to you, and then you have to refine it, and that's sort of where you come in. And yeah, it always felt like to me like what was happening when I was sort of reaching for a creation was that I was casting a fishing rod into these like strange waters, which had very strange animals, and an animal like a high dimensional fish, a fish living in wherever thoughts are, sort of latches onto the hook and starts wriggling, and then I have to like, reel it back onto the boat. That's sort of how it always felt to me when I was engaging in moments of creation. And most clearly for me is my poem Summer Morn, which is linked in the description. You can find it there. But that poem, prose poem really, which sort of fused poetry, prose, and dream logic. That poem really felt like it was not of me. I always like I'd be writing it, and I'd be just kind of perplexed, but also understanding that I was, wherever this creation was taking me, it was going to lead to something valuable. And when the poem got published, it sort of was a validation of that for me. But the main takeaway I sort of want to get here is that a lot of my creativities felt like I was in communication with another entity, almost like a silent entity. That's always how it felt phenomenologically, like from an experiential sort of vantage, and there's a video I'm going to also link in the description where this person is talking about the ancient Hindus and the Upanishads that they wrote. And he was talking about how it seemed like they were speaking about the subconscious in some sense, and so he says, quote, "For they recognized that our thoughts and feelings, when observed up close, seemed to appear out of nothing and then disappear again. It seemed that there was a thinker behind the scenes who produced our thoughts, yet we cannot think of the thinker who does the thinking." And yeah, that's very accurate, right? It kind of feels like the idea came from nowhere, and then it recedes. And so I can kind of use a watchmaker argument in this case. Normally in theology, someone who's sort of trying to argue for the validity of, like, let's say, a god, they would give this example of, like, if you're walking down a beach or something and you happened upon this like very intricately engineered watch. It's like, would you think that watch came from accident, or that it was like purposefully designed? I'm not using that argument in that context, but I am sort of using it for certain ideas that I felt would pop up, where it was like these ideas had so much depth and complexity, and it seemed like they emerged spontaneously. It's like I was standing outside a cave, I was standing outside a dark cave, and then something just like threw this gloriously intricate gold watch at me. And so my inference from that would then be that there is a sort of intelligent entity in the cave that was able to produce this thing of depth and complexity. And so I really liked the phrase We cannot think of the thinker who does the thinking. Or alternately, we cannot see the seer who is seeing. These are sort of ways to try and, I guess, like sort of explicate how the subconscious, or how entities within our the deep layers of our psyche tend to be quite invisible. They tend to sort of operate in our blind spots. Yeah. All right. So another sort of interesting phenomenological experience I had when I was contemplating certain ideas is that, it would feel like I'm juggling these high-dimensional Lego blocks, and once an idea or two concepts sort of start to resonate or sync with each other, it kind of felt like these high-dimensional Lego blocks were clicking into place. It felt like these concepts were in another place, and I was sort of accessing them. And when they harmonize well with each other, so you get this like very satisfying clicking into place. Another very interesting, experience that I think definitely conditioned a lot of how I think now was an experience I had with edibles, right? I was taking them with some friends who I won't mention, on this public forum, but you know who you are, and sort of made rookie errors and took a bit too much. And I had a very sort of overwhelming experience, and it was terrifying in some senses. I thought I was losing my mind for a second there, but what it did was it clued me into the idea that I wasn't just passively receiving sensory data, right? I was also kind of actively shaping it. Like I was playing a role in the sensory data. And when I started getting these like weird sensory effects, that really kind of opened my eyes to that. And so I think, there's actually kind of me getting wind of Kant's Copernican revolution. So the Copernican revolution was in cosmology. We used to think that we were the center of the universe, and then the Copernican revolution came along, and it sort of radically reoriented us. And suddenly we weren't in the center of the universe. We were just like one planet in a galaxy of billions, right? We were just sort of to the side. We weren't taking a central place, and so that was you can imagine how destabilizing and disturbing that sort of realization would be. And so with Kant, when Kant comes along, he says that he sort of inaugurates another Copernican revolution, which is a revolution of such magnitude that it shifts the way that we see ourselves in relation to the universe. And his revolution was basically saying that we shape our sensory data, right? We don't passively receive it. We're sort of constitutively shaping it with these sort of intuitions of space and time. And, so space and time and causality, like these weren't things necessarily in the world itself. They were intuitions that we brought to bear in order to organize experiences. And so I think what the edibles did was sort of clue me into that. And another sort of strange side effect of that was I would have these experiences for like maybe months afterwards. I'd have these experiences where it's like, if I'm trying to go to bed, for example, and I'd sort of close my eyes, I would suddenly start seeing this like flurry of fast changing images, right? Like let's say it would be a snake, and then that would turn into worms, which would turn into grass, which would like turn into a star, which would turn into a planet. And these images only lasted for like half a second, probably even less than that, before they changed, right? And what is interesting for me is it felt like I wasn't producing them at all. It's like I was just an independent spectator watching this, kaleidoscopic slideshow of images in my mind. And it was very fascinating. I don't really experience that anymore. I did for a brief stint a couple years ago, but it's not, that's gone. But it did, the way I also explain it, feels like what that trip did was open a door in my mind which could sort of never be closed again. And yeah, what was interesting to me is that these images were autonomous, right? I wasn't, at least the egoic self, the egoic me, I wasn't producing them, right? I was just watching them happen, and I could feel when my egoic mind started to like massage the images and start to like play a role in where they go, and then I'd get bored. I mean, like, okay, cool, it's not me anymore. But the fact that they were autonomous made me question whether there was an agency that isn't mine that was producing those images, right? I didn't really think about it too much, but that was a sort of vague intuition that I had. Another sort of experience that I had was these weird moments of wonder where it would feel like, like if I had derealization, I spoke about that earlier. The derealization that was very disturbing, and it was overall quite a negative experience. But on the flip side, I'd get these other moments of awareness where the world wouldn't seem real, or it'd seem dreamlike or hyper-real. But instead of that causing any existential angst, it actually caused like these moments of awe inside of me. For example, I remember when I was in university and I was walking to a lecture. I was walking and suddenly the world took on a strange aura, if I can say that. Like things started like glowing slightly, and it felt like there was this like veils of gossamer that sort of sparkled over everything, and I felt like I got put into this like almost like a new dimension, but it was just the same place. It just was a strange experience, and I'd get those quite often where it's like the world would suddenly feel like surreal or hyper real, and like with a faint glow, but it was a much more pleasant experience than the derealization experiences. This is in reference to moments where I'll sort of get these mysterious edicts in my mind, right? So, for example, I was staying with some friends, and I was in my room, and they were on the couch. I opened the door, and I saw them together on the couch, and then this voice in my head that, it wasn't a voice per se, but it kind of was, if it makes sense. It said, "I am you, and you are me," right? And it seemed like the voice wasn't like, it just seemed like it was just letting me know, like, this is just a by the way, thing. And that seems to sort of jive with a lot of positions like open individualism, or, laws of oneness, where we're all connected or similar in some sense. And so coming across those ideas, I was a lot more receptive to them because I'd had this like strange experience of a voice, which isn't a voice, which seemed to come out of nowhere. It was just, and it said, this this mysterious phrase, "I am you, and you are me." And another experience I had with a voice that isn't a voice was when I was just, relaxing or doing my own thing, and I got this message where it kind of said, "I can feel the nothingness frothing under everything." And again, it came with, like, it wasn't trying to like debate, or, oh, you're just like, I'm just letting sort of a by the way thing. And I can link that now to I see how that led me to a certain beliefs now, because it led me to start thinking about nothingness differently, So John Vervaeke has this paper, which I'll link, where he talks about nothingness, amongst many other things, and he quotes this other thinker, Nishitani, and contrasts the Western notion of nothingness, where it's just like this like a privation or absence or pure negativity, or it's just a pure non-being, which was, when I'd spoke earlier about when I was 10 and I'd have death anxiety, and I'd picture, infinity years after my death. It's just such a sort of terrifying nothingness. So you have that Western notion of nothingness contrasted with sort of an Eastern notion of no-thingness, right? And no-thingness isn't the same as sort of like a privation of being, or a lack or an absence of being. If you think about things as bounded, no-thingness just would mean unbounded. And so this no-thingness sort of would actually be a generative matrix of potential, right? It would actually be, like, as Vivek would say, the unintelligible ground of intelligibility, and so this no-thingness is not, it's not nothing, it's not like it's just like absence. It's actually the thing that allows things to come into being, right? We're in a world of things. Like, you could even consider your thoughts and emotions as things in this broader sense. And underlying those things and allowing those things to, like, manifest to you is this ground of no-thingness, which is, you can think about it as like unbounded potential, or Plato had this notion of the chora, which is sort of like a receptacle of being. And it's same thing. It's like, it's the thing, the no-thingness is what hosts things. And so when I came across this idea, I thought back to, the experience when I had the voice tell me that I can feel the nothingness frothing under everything, and I sort of linked it to that, and that's how that sort of played into things. Another moment, on my journey was watching John Viveki. Right? I went through a different, you could say, intellectual phases, and John Viveki was a big one. And what he made me realize was that I was operating with an overly strict definition of knowledge. Right? I thought that knowledge was something like it was logically produced and was based on how well concepts play with each other. Like, are they consistent or inconsistent? What are the chains of entailment? And for me, that was what logic was, right? And so when I was thinking about religion, for example, I would take religion on at that level. I was trying to say, like, this proposition doesn't match this proposition, how is it evil if God is loving, whatever, and wouldn't be satisfied with the answers I was getting. But what John Viveki sort of put me on was, he had this, like, you could call it like a 4-tier system of knowledge, right? So you have propositional knowledge at the top, and that is knowledge like Paris is the capital of France, or down is the opposite of up, right? It's these conceptually laden propositions or sentences or facts that you try and organize. So that's the first level. And then below that, you have procedural knowledge. And that's, for example, like learning how to ride a bike, right? You don't learn to ride a bike by reading a book of, like, just propositions, right? You actually have to do it. And so procedural knowing was a level below propositional. And then below procedural, you had perspectival knowing. And perspectival knowing is deeper than procedural, because it's sort of, you could think about it as sort of your episodic memory, right? It's the knowing of, like, how things felt and how you were oriented or angled or slanted towards different things, the sort of perspective that you're taking up. And then below that, you had participatory knowing. And that was the most difficult to like explain, but for the purposes of this video, it's just to say that it is the most foundational level of knowing. And so propositional knowing, which I used to think was like the be-all and end-all, in John Vervaeke's scheme, was actually just like the top surface layer, and there were all these deeper layers of knowing, which I was kind of overlooking. And Vervaeke said something interesting about that, because he said religion, like, if you think about a lot of religious practices, like, like singing together or praying or doing rituals, it's trying to tap into these deeper, non-propositional, non-verbal ways of knowing, right? In these perspectival and procedural and participatory. And so if I'm engaging with religion on the propositional level, I'm kind of like missing the point of it a little bit. Although I will say, I don't think that makes propositional knowing like useless or anything like that. Like, I still think it's important to be consistent with your concepts and chains of entailment, which I still kind of, with certain religious sects, I find is lacking. And lastly, I would have these experiences where it's like I felt like I could feel the energy of rooms, and that sounds like super and super vague, or like I can feel auras, or like I'm an empath or something like that. But this is just sort of explaining what it was like experientially for me. For example, my first job, when I'd go in the morning, I would dread having to walk through the front office where everyone was sitting to get to my desk. And that was, I mean, for a number of reasons, social anxiety for one. But another one was because when I'd enter the room, it felt like I was just wading into this like vibrational, ocean, and with different pulses and different angles. And so I don't know, I do that because I felt like it wasn't just like a a subjective thing, it felt like it was something I was perceiving out there. Although again, at this stage, I'm not using this to try and justify religion. I'm still sort of just explaining my experiences and how they eventually conditioned my beliefs downstream of that. And now we start, and sort of, we were in the experiential phase, now we're moving on to the more intellectual phase of my deconversion from atheism. And yeah, it started with Jordan Peterson. Yeah, I know, I was a Peterson fanboy back in the day. I went through a whole phase with him, which shames me slightly to say. But yeah, he was definitely sort of like an intellectual gateway drug for me, because before then I never really used to watch, these like multiple hour long lectures on YouTube. But with his personality lectures and then his Bible lectures, that sort of inaugurated me into that world. Then from there I went to like Theories of Everything, Kurt John Manga's channel. And then I went to, Bernardo Kastrup, and then John Vervaeke, and the Robert Sapolsky lectures on biology. So Peterson was the person who broke the dam in that regard. And so, I sort of left, I left the Peterson train, I think maybe it was around COVID, when, I mean, I probably just cottoned onto it too late, but his tweets were just so out of pocket, so now I'm on not much, but, alas. I mean, currently now, my sort of three horsemen that I'm for, like my intellectual phases that I'm in right now are Matt Siegel, Alex Gomez-Marin, and Keelan of Formscapes. For me, those three are really sort of leading the charge in the way that I'm thinking right now. And how this sort of relates to my atheism, or lack thereof right now, is that before Peterson, I kind of viewed religion as intellectually bankrupt. Like, it didn't really stand up to much scrutiny. But where I watched Peterson, I found it intellectually stimulating. When I was watching the Bible lectures, I found him interesting. And so it was fascinating to me that someone could be talking about religion and I could still find it like intellectually stimulating. And I disagree with a lot of what Peterson says now, but that first Bible lecture where he's talking about dreams and Jung and the Bible and all of that, I still quite agree with that, and I think he hit the nail on the head in that specific in that specific topic. And I think another thing that Peterson sort of inaugurated for me was a sort of non-materialist inkling, right? Because, like, for example, when he's talking about these mythological stories, and Cain and Abel, let's say, and someone asks him, do you think that actually happened? Right? And then, evasive as ever, Peterson would say, they're always happening, right? And a bit of an exasperating reply, but now that I'm further on in my intellectual journey, I understand that Peterson actually had some Platonist intuitions, right? He would say, for example, the archetypes are realer than real, which to me is just sort of a restatement of forms taking primacy in sort of your ontological scheme, right? So Plato's forms, which were used to account for sameness across different entities, right? It's like you got 5 different dogs here. What is it that they share in common? And Plato's answer was that they share the form of darkness, and that form of darkness is more primary, right? It takes precedence. And so I think that when he'd say things like these things are rooted in real, that they're always happening, because he wasn't maybe trained in philosophy, he never mentioned Plato or any link to that at all, which I found strange. But yeah, I always sort of had this non-materialist inkling. And what's interesting is that this Platonist sort of regime is the complete inverse of spatio-temporal naturalism, right? Where space and time are taken as primary, right? The main stage of reality is space and time. But, with Plato, for example, it's like, no, space and time are actually derivative. Like they come in later in the game. They're not where the main action is happening. And so that definitely accorded with my sort of idealist intuitions. And with Hibbs' paper, Hibbs had this paper where he's like, who's an idealist? Because he tries to distinguish between Platonic idealism and sort of more mentalistic modern idealism, right? And I think he did. I'll link the paper below. But what is interesting is that they share this intuition of there being sort of a non-spatial element to reality that is more primary than the spatial reality that we inhabit. And so even though they differ, I think that they have that in common, sort of Platonic idealism, and then like the more modern forms of idealism, which are more about like mentation and consciousness, which Platonic idealist strand wasn't really about. Another thing that Peterson clued me onto was that as a creative, and I think creatives tend to sort of gravitate, a lot of us anyway, to Jungian stuff. He sort of mentioned Jung and spoke about dreams and the subconscious, and these things that always fascinated me, right? And what I found interesting with Jung is that he had this distinction between the personal subconscious and the collective subconscious, which I think is quite vital. And the way he sort of made that distinction was that he found that these stories that he collects across different cultures, he'd see that they have thematic through lines and similarities that were sort of cross-cultural, and that sort of allowed him to make the inference that these things aren't just like merely personally created; they're coming from something deeper, And with the poem I mentioned earlier, "Summer Mourned," I realized that poem was actually very archetypal. Spoken about like a sky father and earth mother. Like it had that. It sort of played with that archetype, and so I didn't put that in there purposefully. I didn't know about these other stories. Only like later on when I reread it, where I saw that this actually has a lot of thematic similarities with these mythological stories, and so yeah, it was very interesting. And here, another thing you put me on is that myths aren't just stories, but they encode in cross-generational patterns. Right? Myths aren't just like the cherry on top of the cake or something like that, like decorative. They're actually pointing to some very deep patterns that persist across time. And he'd give he gave an analysis of the Garden of Eden, which was like the dawn of metacognition, like the dawn of becoming self-conscious. He gave that analysis, which I always found pretty interesting. But I mean, generally, I'm a bigger fan of John Vervaeke. I feel like he's got all the good things about Peterson, and he's better at them with none of the bad parts. And it's not coincidental that Vervaeke is a Neoplatonist, right? I don't think that's a coincidence based on what we've been speaking about. And Vervaeke would also talk about perennial patterns, right? There's another way of talking about sort of Platonic forms, or Peterson or Jungian / Peterson would speak about archetypes. They're all broadly synonymous. why I'm talking about metaphysics in relation to my deconversion from atheism is because, like I said, the atheism that I'm talking about is atheo-materialism, materialism / physicalism. And so me questioning physicalism led to me also questioning atheism, right? And so that's sort of how it ties in. So we're going to get it sort of more deeply into the metaphysics of things here. My previous video was about metaphysics, which regards, it's asking what's the relationship between the empirical sciences and theoretical metaphysics, and sort of going through that. So you can check that video out if that sounds interesting to you. Yeah. So all of these intellectual peregrinations or journeys that I took sort of led me to question my sort of presumptive operating system of physicalism, right? I sort of, if you grow up westernized, then physicalism does seem to sort of be the default. Like it's sort of what you default to. Because even when I was 10 years old, thinking about death and God and all of that, I was still conditioned by some of those presuppositions without knowing what they were. So yeah, it was interesting. And so, I'm sort of coming from a position of qualia foundationalism. Qualia is just like a technical term in philosophy, which refers to experience. Although I'm using it broadly here, I'm not like talking about qualia being ineffable or anything like that. That's later beyond the scope of this video. And foundationalism is a position in epistemology, epistemology being the philosophical study of knowledge. And it's basically the view that some beliefs can, justifiably be held by inference from other beliefs, which themselves are justified directly, right? So you have a foundation, and from that sort of unshakable foundation, you start your inferences and speculations. And so, taking qualia foundationalism together, it's basically my thinking changed to seeing experiences as the raw materials for your metaphysical speculation, rather than seeing them as an obstacle to knowledge, right? The sort of broadly naturalist way of seeing experiences is that they are things that you need to control for and hygienically keep out of your productions. From there, qualia is seen as like an obstacle to knowledge and something that you have to overcome or climb over in order to get to knowledge. And so I sort of started going in the opposite direction of seeing that experiences are our foundation, and therefore we shouldn't sort of cavalierly cast them aside. I do want to mention, that there are other epistemological positions rather than foundationalism. Like there is anti-foundationalism, for example, that says that there is no fundamental belief or principle which could be the basic ground of inquiry and knowledge. I'm still broadly foundationalist, but I'm also sort of exploring anti-foundationalism right now, and so I just thought it would be salient to mention. I think I mentioned this earlier, is that all metaphysics are elaborations of intuitions. So you just pick your intuition and then you start going from there. It's not like any particular position is immune to being intuitive, right? And so, for example, I think with physicalism or materialism, its core intuition is the idea that of these like visual, tactile objects among us, objects that you can see and objects that you can touch, and you take those as your base, and then you sort of existentially generalize that to the rest of the universe. That's the intuition that is driving the materialism. Whereas I think idealism has a different intuition, where it's focusing more on like our ghostly interiors or emotions, thoughts, whatever. Like that's the primary intuition of idealism, and the system is built from there. Another thing to sort of keep in mind, which I will be touching on more later, is sort of what Bernardo Kastrup titled conflating empirical observations with theoretical abstractions, or alternately and rather synonymously, Alfred North Whitehead sort of called as the concreteness fallacy. They're basically just exploring the same thing here. But it is when you treat a theoretical entity as if it is a concrete observation. And if you do this, it leads to some theoretical issues downstream from that. Strawson, I'm going to link his article, in the description below, but I think that he sort of hit the nail on the head when he said that, it is on consciousness that's mysterious, it's matter, and that we are deeply committed to thinking that we know more about matter than we do, and that sort of, if we undo that very firm intuition, the landscape looks differently. And what this all sort of amounts to is that if you conflate empirical observations and theoretical abstractions, or with Whitehead, if you make if you fallaciously make a theoretical entity concrete, and you don't take heed of Strawson's problem of matter, what this will do is it'll lead to you seeing a position like idealism, for example, as like wildly speculative metaphysics, while physicalism, is just like sort of sticking to the hard facts. Right, so we'll be talking about more metaphysics here. So one thing I want to start with, sort of framing this, is to distinguish between what Kant called noumena and phenomena. Phenomena we can just consider as our ordinary sensory environment, of tables, chairs, rocks, mountains, right? That's what phenomena is. Noumena, on the other hand, is what underlies phenomenon, right? It's the cause of the phenomena, and noumena are sort of regarded as imperceptible. Although I do sort of want to mention that I am using noumena loosely here, right? I'm not necessarily advocating that noumena is unknowable or anything like that, as Kant said. I'm just kind of using it to distinguish it between phenomena. And what I want to impress upon you is that metaphysics deals with noumena, not phenomena, right? Metaphysics is trying to deal with the thing that underlies the phenomena and causes it, rather than the phenomena itself. Although, if you're like a radical empiricist or something like that, you might be suspicious about, imperceptible noumena or anything like that. That's sort of beyond the scope of the video. But that point is well taken. Another distinction that I want to make was made by Stoya, and I'll link here. There's an article in the SCP about physicalism. And another distinction that I want to make here is between two uses of the word physical, right? And Stoya, so he very helpfully sort of distinguishes between object physicalism and theory physicalism. Object physicalism refers to sort of what we more colloquially mean by the word physical, right? Objects like tables and chairs, and things of that nature, whereas theory physicalism refers to physics, right? And what physics can tell us about the universe. And we need to be careful not to conflate or confuse those two things, right? In using the word physical, when object physicalism and theory physicalism at different points, right? And the important thing to note is that these two concepts of physical, as Stoya says, are not coextensive, which is just fancy way of saying that they don't refer to the same things. They're sort of mutually incompatible. You can't use physical in both senses and still be coherent, right? And so, I want to sort of get deeper into the weeds here. Right? So what is physical? What does it mean for something to be physical? Right? And, Hempel's dilemma is a well-known sort of challenge to theory physicalism, because when people use the word physical, at least in the metaphysical context, they're typically referencing physics, right? The entities and postulates that physics deals with. And so you would want to define physicalism in reference to physics. Hempel's dilemma tries to problematize that, right? And it basically says, which physics are you talking about? Defining physicalism as referencing current physics? And if so, then it's trivially false, because we know that current physics isn't complete. And if you're referring to some ideal complete physics in the future, then it sort of becomes empty, right? We don't know what physics will be like in the future, and so we can't, like, to use it to define physical is to not say much at all. And so this is sort of the challenge that Hempel's dilemma poses to people who want to define physicalism in reference to physics, right? You sort of have to overcome this dilemma if you want to sort of get cogent over there. And so I'm referencing Jessica Wilson here, and I'll sort of link a paper that she has about this, right? She sort of goes through this stepwise phase, right? She goes, you try to define physicalism via current physics, via ideal physics, and she accepts, at least if I'm understanding correctly, that accepts Hempel's dilemma. And so if you accept it, then we're left with this mystery of how are we defining physical, right? And so she introduces or explicates the no fundamental mentality thesis, which basically says that what it means for something to be physical is that it is not fundamentally mental. And in that sense, now you have a coherent and positive account of what it means for something to be physical. And so that's sort of how she gets around it. But what I want to impress upon you is that this no fundamentality thesis, it's not an empirical finding, right? It's a metaphysical abstraction. It's a theoretical inference. And so what I would want to argue is that the hard problem isn't an empirical problem, it's conceptual. Philip Goff sort of made a similar argument. There's this video, I'll link it again in the description, by Richard Brown, where he watches I think 4 academics, sort of Neil Seth is one of them, detail what they think. And so Richard Brown sort of took issue with framing it like this, which I found interesting, where he's like, no, like the empirical stuff is adding something constitutive to this, or it's something substantive rather, to this debate. And so we shouldn't only think about it so like that. And yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. It definitely made me wonder, but yeah, I'm still like, my current thinking is that the hard problem isn't empirical, it's conceptual. And it's only, I get the impression, for example, that a lot of physicalists, they feel like, let's say non-physicalists, they feel like non-physicalists are sort of just working on gut intuition, right? They'll say something like, it doesn't seem like the physical, or it doesn't seem like consciousness is physical. And you could justly ask, like, well, it doesn't really matter what it seems like, right? That's not really an argument. It seems like you're just sort of going off of gut intuition. And so I'd want to sort of sharpen that and say that the hard problem is only valid in relation to the no fundamentality thesis, right? If you add the no fundamentality thesis into your notion of what it means to be physical, that's the hard problem. You've generated the hard problem. And so I'd sort of want to mention that, to show that it's not just like I'm trying to proffer some sort of vague intuition where like it seems like consciousness is physical and it's hard to imagine how consciousness could arise from. So like, I'd want to sort of sharpen that and say that the hard problem is only hard in relation to the no fundamentality thesis, right? And so what happens, because we've inherited, as John Gaveke would say, a sort of Cartesian grammar, which is just to say like the thinking of Descartes has sort of thoroughly suffused our conceptual structures, so that we interpret these theoretical entities, or things like wave functions and quantum fields and different forces, right? We sort of implicitly and reflexively interpret these theoretical entities under the rubric of like external world realism. So these theoretical entities are out there. They're not just like human made stuff. Spatio-temporal naturalism, which again is just saying that these entities are in a space-time domain, and physical realism, which is just to say that these entities do not contain fundamental mentality, right? And we sort of make these inference like in a snap, and I think that's just because it's like centuries of inertia. The founding ontology of science as it is modernly practiced is a materialistic one, and so it feels very natural to treat theoretical entities like this. But it's not necessarily having to be the case, right? Because, and this is something that Bertrand Russell pointed out, where he pointed out that physics works under solipsism, right? It's not like physics contradicts solipsism or physics says that solipsism is false or anything like that. Like it works. It's not blown up by that. He obviously doesn't go in that route, but he makes, I think, the salient point. And if you sort of really grok this, and you can see how we could have more freedom in interpreting our theoretical entities in different ways without being necessarily tied to a particular way of framing, and so when these metaphysical inferences get treated as empirical facts, right, like the metaphysical inference of the no fundamentality thesis, when that gets treated as if it's an empirical fact that science just says, then any other inferences that non-physicalists will make will get treated as wild speculation or departing from basic facts. And I sort of see that rhetoric around, and I would want to challenge that. Okay, let's look at the problem a bit more closely and more concretely. It's a bit abstract, so I'm going to try and concretize it with some examples. So, we'll look at this in action by regarding neural corridors of consciousness and interventions on the brain that change someone's conscious state. Okay, so let's term the perceptible phenomenal brain as brain P, right? And there it is, we're all familiar with that. And then the noumenal brain, right, the one that's underlies the phenomena, the perceptible phenomena of the brain, we'll call that brain N. And, this is the closest we can get to sort of describing what it's like. It's the least incorrect way is just to do equations, but because Himpel's dilemma undercuts explaining the physical in terms of physics, and we need the no fundamentality thesis in order to sort of make physicalism coherent again, as I argued in the previous slide. That means that we can't positively identify what this thing looks like, right? We also have to do it via negativa, as they call it, where you define the brain as what it's not rather than what it is, so it's hard to sort of positively identify what it is. And this goes back to Strawson's article in The Hard Problem of Matter, when he's saying that we are deeply committed to thinking we know more about matter than we actually do, right? And so this is basically what I was saying. It's impossible to picture what a brain would look like. The noumenal brain would look like under physicalism. Like, it's hard to understand what that would even mean. And it's important to keep in mind that the noumena is the causal element, not the phenomena, which is the effect. Right? It's the noumena that bears causal power, and not the phenomena, which is the effect of the noumena. And so, positing something physical, which is, say, something non-experiential or independent from experience, actually comes at quite a high epistemic cost, as Castro put it, from the standpoint of qualia foundationalism, right? So, because qualia foundationalism says that experience is our starting point, whereas if we're positing a physical brain, right, a physical noumenal brain, then it is completely independent of any experience, and so it contrasts that, and it kind of seems like we're unaware of the cost of positing something that is non-experiential or non-mental. Kind of like a trust fund can sort of casually spending $5,000 on shoes or something. It's like it's too cavalier, and we don't necessarily recognize how much it costs. And just to reiterate, we intuitively think that the physical is the obvious thing, right? The physical is just tables and chairs around us. But remember, once again, what Stolia said, right? You have object physicalism and theory physicalism. Object physicalism is referring to like our tables and chairs, but theory physicalism, which is what people normally mean when they say physical, right, is referencing physics. And so we must keep that distinction in mind, and further, into the sort of maximal unintuitiveness of something physical, if we are defining physical by the no fundamentality thesis, right? And so, does a tree, when it falls in the forest, make a sound? Let's go down these steps and see where we end up. So here we have a tree, and wanted to represent all the sensory modalities, right? So the tree has a feeling, that's the hand on it. It has color, it has sound, which is the birds, twittering in the branches. It has smell, which is like the little lines. You can see this was to sort of represent the fumes of the smell. And so it has all of these experiential components, right? And so what happens when we so remove each layer, right? So like you're standing in front of this tree, and it's giving you all these experiential phenomena, right? So what happens when you're not at the tree? Well, firstly, there'll be no color, right? Because color is only when wavelengths enter your retina and are processed, sort of by the brain. If you're not there for the wavelengths to sort of hit your retina, then the tree doesn't have any color, right? So we can take that. No color, okay. Does the tree have any sound? Well, same thing, right? Sound waves only have sound when they hit your eardrums and are converted to such when you're there. So you're not there, the tree doesn't have any sound, right? Okay, so the birds are gone. Does it have a touch, right? And I think you can see where I'm going with this, right? No, it doesn't have touch, again, because these experiences are only meaningful if you're there, right? If you're not there, then there is no, the tree doesn't feel like anything. And right, there we go. And does it have a smell? Well, no, this is the same thing, right? And so what is left? So we typically kind of think that the geometry of the tree, right, its shape, its size, if it's moving in the wind, its motion, right, that's what's there, what remains when I'm not there. And this is very reminiscent of John Locke's account of primary and secondary qualities, which Berkeley sort of undermined, like Bishop Berkeley. So Locke was primarily a materialist, and he wanted to have a coherent account of it. And so what he said was, there are secondary qualities and primary qualities. Secondary qualities are things like color, taste, smell, right? And these don't resemble the thing in itself, right? The actual tree that's out there. But there are primary qualities such as shape, motion, size. And these qualities do resemble the tree as it is when it's not being perceived by anyone, right? And so this is how he kind of tries to maneuver things. But, Berkeley sort of tries to question this. And he says, well, no, what by virtue of what are you staking this distinction upon, right? Because it's like, okay, color is a secondary quality because, if you're colorblind, you'll see the leaves as yellow, let's say, and I see them as green. And so because there's a disparity, we know that color is not fundamental to the tree, because whatever is fundamental is objective, right? It shouldn't change with perspective. But then Berkeley argues shape as well can change based on different vantages, right? From where you stand, a rectangle could look like a square, or whatever angles you look at it. And if we think about relativity, then the motion as well changes via the different reference frames. And so again, he's trying to undermine this distinction where it's like the shape, motion, and size of the tree are just as much experiential qualities that are determined by a perspective than sound, smell, and all of that. And so if we remove the geometry and the sound and motion, what's left? Right? Well, then we don't know what that is, right? And that's why Locke actually, he kind of admits this in a way where he says, like, matter is an I know not what, right? That's what he says. We have to sort of conclude that, which I think kind of undermines the primary secondary distinction. But he, him being sort of philosophically rigorous and honest with his entanglements, realizes that what matter is I know not what, right? Which again brings us back to the no fundamentality thesis, right? We can only define the physical by what's not by what it is, and if we're thinking about idealism, right, if you try to do the same thing with idealism, we can positively identify what remains, and that's a whole other story, but long story short, we at least know that whatever remains in the tree, when or not there, is an experience. Okay, so let's look at an unambiguous example of an intervention on the brain causing a change in consciousness, keeping in mind the framework that we built earlier, right? So we have brain P, which is the phenomenal brain, or the perceptual brain, and then brain N, which is the noumenal brain. And on top of that, we can let mind, which is, let's say, thoughts, emotion, and imaginings, let that be mind I, right? And so, when someone says the brain does this and the brain does that, this is how they sort of usually imagine the story going. You have the phenomenal brain, right, the perceptible brain, and the arrow, let's just call it an intervention, right? So let's say we're in open brain surgery, and the arrow is the surgeon poking a different part of the brain or stimulating a different part of the brain, right? And then that leads to that's a religious experience, right? That's an angel, let's just say. And then they do the intervention, and then the patient has a religious experience, right? And so with this sort of thinking, and you go, well, therefore the brain causes consciousness, and therefore physicalism is true, right? Because this is an unambiguous example of an intervention on the brain, which is brain P, right, the phenomenal brain, influencing mind I. But, with the framework we built earlier, we can sort of challenge this and see, because this whole scheme is actually quite metaphysically neutral, right? People normally think that it's vindicating physicalism, but I would argue that it can be easily accommodated by other metaphysics. Although again, Richard Brown, the video he was watching with Neil Seth and Philip Goff and everything, I'll link it again. Philip Goff made the same point, and Richard Brown sort of pushed back on that and saying that no, you can sort of experimentally differentiate between different metaphysics, at least especially with dualism. So, that is interesting, and I'm sort of still chewing on that. Right, and so, yeah, this is metaphysically neutral, right? Brain P is not physical in the theory physicalist sense, right? Remember, theory physicalist sense is talking about noumena and making reference to physics, whereas object physicalism makes reference to objects. And so that brain wouldn't be physical if we were using physical to the object physicalism. But typically when people use the word physical, they're making reference to physics, right? And so then that brain isn't physical. Right. So if we want to be consistent, right, and we're using physical in the theory physicalist sense, then we should rather render the previous example like this, right? Brain N, which is the noumenal brain, gets intervened upon by the open brain surgeon. He stimulates a particular thing, and then someone has a religious experience. That's it, right? They say that they saw God, and because like I said, physicalism is a metaphysics that deals with noumena, and that's why we're brain N, which is the noumenal brain, it should be how we're imagining this, right? And so because this brain lacks any experience, right? It's independent of experience. That's what it means to be objective. Then this is the real causal agent in this scenario, right? It's actually brain N causing, if we're in the physical theoretic sense, where physical makes reference to physics, right? And so when you say the brain does this and the brain does that, you should keep in mind that we're talking about brain N. And for me, once I really grokked this, then I sort of grasped the hard problem, and I realized what it is. Because before then, I thought the hard problem was kind of like a word game or something. So that people, they want something to be true, they want the universe to be magical or whatever, and so they just invent this problem. But clearly, intervention of the brain causes differences in someone's experience, right? And so framing it like this, I think, sort of clarifies the situation and speaks to why the hard problem is hard. Okay, so now we can sort of carry on into the metaphysics of this all. And like I said earlier, the driving intuition of idealism, I think, is the interiority, or the non-physicality of the interiority. Our thoughts and moods and emotions, they don't feel like tangible physical things, right? And so that's the sort of driving intuition. Although even though I currently sort of am leaning idealist, that is sort of my metaphysical home. Alex Gomez Marine said something interesting. When he was being interviewed by the Essentia Foundation, he was asked, so it's like, what is your metaphysics? And he said that he thinks that, we've had such a long reign of physicalism that we need to let other positions breathe, other non-physicalistic things breathe. We need a time where they're sort of all in the area and talking and competing against each other before we just leap, to another one. Because how it happened for me is I just sort of jumped from physicalism to idealism without like checking other different positions like dualism and dual aspect monism and all of that, And Kurt Mungle of Theories of Everything, he also he made this post once where he said, why is it that the primary non-physicalists or idealists, why not all these other positions like neutral, monism, dual aspect, and dualism, all of that? So that point is well taken, and I do have leanings as well to sort of dual aspect monism. And there's an article I'll link below by Jiri Bonovsky titled Dual Aspect Monism, and it sort of goes into the potential pitfalls and motivations for such a position. I think I'd still kind of go with the dual aspect idealism. Nikolai Pilgard, he has a triadic idealism that he goes for, as opposed to sort of a monistic one, that maybe Castro would endorse. And so I'm attracted to positions where it's trying to bridge between the one and the many without necessarily collapsing one into the other. But there are some challenges, that dual aspect monism will have to overcome. And can read some quotes on the paper here to see what Bonovsky says. Now, let us face the main difficulty in explaining dual aspect monism, namely to explain what an aspect is. I will be content if I can provide an explanation, even if not a definition. One way to put the question is to ask what the difference is between an aspect and a property. An aspect is not a property, that much is clear. Right. And so, yeah, that's very important because we don't want, we want our dual aspect monism to differentiate itself, one, from property dualism, which is the position that you have one substance, one physical substance that can house both mental and physical properties. We also want to counteract it against differentiated from substance dualism, which says that, you have two substances, mental and physical, and they each bear their own physical and mental properties, and neutral monism, which says that, the ground is neither mind nor matter. So I think that any dual aspect monism worth its salt will have to make sure it sort of differentiates between the two. And Bronowski does go into this later in the paper, so you should check that out if you're interested. And another sort of question you can ask is, like, what would the motivation be for sort of a dual aspect monism, right? Like I can imagine, for example, Bernardo Kastrup, who of the theoretical virtues ranks parsimony the highest, right? He wants his parsimony is sort of an Occam's razor type posit. Do not needlessly multiply your entities. And so for him, monism is perfect because it's one, right? You don't have to go any further. So dual aspect monism, where you're kind of trying to put two, seems to counteract the tenet of parsimony. But there are other theoretical virtues and different ways of ranking them, and so I won't get into that. But I think Bronowski kind of makes the point well over here. We all seem to have the intuition that the mental and the physical are in some sense deeply different. This intuition of a deep difference is what motivates the debate, and at the same time constitutes a burden for any reductive attempt to explain one in terms of the other. So I'm interested in this position, but yeah, it does have some challenges. But I am sort of getting swayed away from like purely monistic or monism idealisms, just because I'm sort of looking for an ontology with maybe more dynamism. The one and the many is not necessarily reducing the many to the one or the one to the many. They're kind of like held in tension, something like that. And so, triadic idealism, I like that. And dual aspect monism or multi-aspect monism, could fulfill that role too. And yeah, this is sort of something I'm also quite intrigued by, this motivation. Why does it seem that our interior and exterior domains have such different modes of presentation? Like that seems like it's thirsting for an explanation. And you want to sort of preserve that intuition, without entailing that the interior and the exterior are substantively different, rather than slide into substance dualism, without incurring this like unbridgeable dualism, but giving slightly different accounts of why they present themselves the way that they do. And I'm sort of looking into Bohm's stuff. Bohm had his implicate and explicit domains, and the implicate domain I would map to our interiorities, right? Emotions, moods, thoughts, imagination. And the reason why those things aren't publicly available is because they are enfolded upon themselves, right? Everything in Bohm's implicate order is enfolded upon and connected to itself. And so, that might sort of provide a direction to explaining why, for example, exterior objects are publicly observable, right? We can all see the table over there, but interior ones are not. And so the explicate order would obviously be the exterior. And I want to sort of say that the implicate takes primacy, and its activity is the explicate order. So that's sort of where I'm at right now. I'm trying to bridge these things. However, what I would need to be convinced of is that that quality of foundationalism doesn't necessitate idealism as the shortest route, right? Like, if you start with quality foundationalism, which is taking experience to be your like basic unit, your basic datum of existence, different metaphysics will take different amounts of steps to get there, and it seems like idealism is the shortest route, that someone can take from quality foundationalism to a metaphysics. And so, I sort of want to explore that. And so, it's to sort of sum up this whole metaphysical detour that we've gone in, deconstructing physicalism and sort of deconverting from it opened me up to different ideas, and that coupled with some of those strange experiences, I was speaking about earlier, sort of really cushioned me and guided me in terms of positions that I found attractive versus ones that I did not. Okay, all right. So, if I'm not an atheist, then, what am I? How would I characterize myself as things stand? So I would be reticent to ally myself to any specific like religion or faith or denomination, right? We'll look at Christian or Muslim. And this is because, there's the problem of many gods, right? Like when I was dyed-in-the-wool atheist, I used to ask this all the time, like, there have been so many different gods proposed from so many different cultures. What are the chances that the one that you happen to be born into is the right one and the other ones are incorrect? Right? It seemed arbitrary. And so, I'm attracted to more like a perennialist pathway, which basically says that there are common through lines in major religions, their perspective of God, and that's sort of what we should focus on, the points of commonality, without necessarily collapsing into a particular domain, right? And the problem of evil, I think, also is something that needs accounting for, right? If I had this question when I was an atheist, which is why, if God is all loving and this is just the most forceful and simple argument, then why is there so much evil in the world? And I'm sort of interested in ideas that see God as morally neutral, right? Or God is not necessarily like clairvoyant, so God can get surprised too and surprises himself or herself. It's the kind of more of a spontaneous unfolding, as Bernard or Kashrap would say, rather than a deliberate plan that was set out. And there's the concept of Leela. I think it's from ancient Hinduism, which is like the play of gods, right? So it's like in that mode, God is playing, and playing isn't necessarily like he's not doing it from a moral standpoint. It's just like I think about, for example, if I was like in an ant colony, and suddenly I see these giants stamping on all of our homes, and just tearing apart, everything we hold dear. And they would say, how evil, are these giants? And then you zoom out and it's just like humans playing rugby, for example, right? That could be something. Although again, I'm also still open to the idea, God being sort of pure love or something like that. We just have to shift around a lot of things. But yeah, that's sort of where I'm at in regards to that. So I wouldn't ally myself to a particular religion. I do, like right now, I'm sort of interested in framing it in Vedic terms, with Brahman and Atman and all of that. And so I would consider myself a panentheist as it stands, right? So the way this is usually phrased is classical theism has God as external to and independent of the universe, and he's sort of like reaching in there and sort of tinkering with it, but he's kind of outside. And then you have pantheism, which tries to unite nature and God so that they're basically the same thing. And then panentheism, which tries to kind of fuse both, so that God is kind of outside and inside the world, like there is a transcendent aspect but also an aspect that is immanent within and sort of suffusing the world. So, it's a blend of transcendent and immanence, and I'd sort of consider that as my theological standpoint. However, again, let's take note of the fact that idealism is not theism, right? So just because you become an idealist or a non-physicalist or whatever doesn't necessarily necessitate that you it's a theistic position. And there's an article from Brenton Rome, which is great. It's great paper. And there's a segment there that I want to read that sort of touches upon this. Okay, so he's here arguing for sort of idealist panpsychism as opposed to a materialist panpsychism. And so let's read. However, panpsychism is superior to the God hypothesis for explaining the regularity of the world, because I already know that at least one finite conscious perspective exists, my own, and have good reasons to think that there are many finite conscious perspectives. Whereas we have no independent evidence or strong reasons for thinking that an infinite subject exists. So, pause. The infinite subject here then would be God, right? So that's typically how I think of God as an infinite subject. And so it's interesting that Brenton Rome is trying to, stake an idealism that's independent of whether there is an infinite subject. Okay, play. Let's carry on reading. Occam's razor applies to not multiplying types of entities without good cause, not to entities that are already known. Panpsychism is hence metaphysically simpler because it employs a type of subject that we already know exists to explain the world's continuity. The God hypothesis is more metaphysically complex because it introduces a new type of entity, a transcendent infinite subject to explain the continued existence of the world. And so, obviously I looked the paper from Brenton Rome, and I definitely highly recommend it. But it's interesting here that, he's finding a position that is idealistic but non-theistic. And then there also is another paper that I'll link, which explicitly touches on this, right? And it's titled Idealism Without God, and it's by Helen Yetta Chappell. It's also quite an interesting paper, and I like how it sort of stakes things out. Right, so is all of this a dream, right? I am partial to that perspective. I think Brahman is the silent witness, the cosmic self, and we inhabit the dream of this entity, right? But I would like to point towards a section of Bernardo Kastrup's dissertation, right? Because saying this is a dream is an analogy, and all analogies break somewhere, right? So exactly how far are we going to take this dream analogy? So let's read from Kastrup's paper. It's a section where he's going over objections that people typically give to idealism and trying to refute them. Okay. The natural world objection. The natural order objection. The world we perceive around ourselves is governed by stable and orderly natural laws. Therefore, if the contents of perception are a representation of phenomenality in universal consciousness, then this phenomenality must be stable and orderly at root. But our own personal thoughts and emotions are notoriously unstable and disorderly. So how plausible is it that the order and stability we discern in the laws of nature represent thoughts or emotion in universal consciousness? The misconception here, of course, is that of anthropomorphization, to attribute to universal consciousness a whole cognitive characteristics known only in small dislocated segments of it, such as human beings. Nothing in idealism precludes the possibility that phenomenality and universal consciousness unfolds according to very stable and orderly patterns and regularities, where extrinsic appearance corresponds to the laws of nature, that our human thoughts and emotions seem rather reactive and unstable, is a product of evolution under the pressures of natural selection within a particular planetary ecosystem. At a universal level, consciousness has not undergone such evolutionary pressures. Okay, so the reason that I'm reading that is to point again to the analogies and disanalogies that I want to point out with the dreams, right? Okay, so what are the analogies of a dream? Okay, so let's go through this. In dreams, the percepts, right, the environment that you perceive are symbolic, right? They're not literal. For example, if you're having a dream about, let's say, a horse chasing you, you could say that actually symbolizes my grandfather traumatizing me. Like, it can symbolize anything. But the main point is that what you see isn't literal, it's symbolic. And so generalizing this is the world you see around us right now, right? Again, the world of tables and chairs. I would argue these percepts too are symbolic and not literal. And so, that's one analogy of dreams. Another one is that the outside is inside. And what do I mean by that? So let's think about when you're dreaming, right? Your dream character finds itself reposed within an external tactile environment, right? But when you wake up, you realize that that external environment is actually still inside your mind. And so just like that, our current perceptions of the world outside is actually inside the mind of God, right? And so that's analogy number 2. It should be kept in mind again that when we're talking about the world we actually inhabit now, we are dream characters and not the dreamer, right? That's important. And a disanalogy, and which is why I read this quote from Kastrup, is that our dreams tend to be quite chaotic and intense and confusing. However, when we perceive the world, we see stable, orderly patterns, as Kastrup pointed out. And so that would be a disanalogy in one way in which reality isn't a dream in the way that we dream. Because I think we'd forced to surmise that whatever dream is happening, we're seeing a slice of it that is very orderly and goes in sort of these stable repetitions. And so, yeah, I think that would be sort of the analogies and disanalogies I'd want to point out in regards to in what sense is reality like a dream. And I want to note, again, that I'm not saying that reality is a dream isn't the same thing as saying that it's not real, right? Dreams are real. It's like Donald Hoffman says, take reality seriously, just not literally. So this isn't some sort of like naive solipsism or, like denying the external world exists. I'm just denying that the external world is literal, right? It's rather infused with symbols. The bifurcation of nature is a concept that Alfred North Whitehead sort of introduced, right? And it basically states that, when we sort of inherited, as John Vervaeke would say, a Cartesian grammar, right, which is a way of framing the world, which replicates sort of Descartes' split between mindless res extensa and mindful res cogitans, which are inside. Now, yeah, for Whitehead, that means we bifurcated nature. We split it, and we need to heal that bifurcation. And in order to do that, that means that we need to put like all the things that we thought were just like our interior subjective things, like meaning, emotions, things of that nature. We need to project that back out in nature, right, in order to heal this bifurcation. So you have to buy the argument that the bifurcation is a real problem, before you would sort of accept any potential solutions to it. But what this would mean again is that, going back to the dream analogy, dreams have meaning, right? And so if we extrapolate that to the lives that we live now, that means our lives are also meaningful, and we're not naively projecting meaning onto a cold, machine-like world in this thinking. It's that the world itself bears meaning. It is inherently meaningful. Like it has its own, it has its own meaning, and very interesting way of looking at it, right? So it's like if you're looking up at the night sky and you see these stars, then you could interpret that as, we're sort of witnessing a great drama unfold, of which sort of that the drama spent itself out, but we're seeing its footprints. So, the bifurcation of nature means that we need to put things like meaning back into the world instead of just like collapsing it into our interior subjectivity. And again, with the dream analogy, in Platonism, space-time is derivative, right? It's like I mentioned earlier, in Platonism, there is a non-spatial and non-temporal world which takes primacy. Space and time are secondary derivatives of a deeper non-spatial order. Whereas, right, for spatio-temporal naturalism, again, space-time is the whole stage. And this links to the whole outside is inside thing again, right? So the world we perceive outside is inside the mind of God, right? And so we need to sort of keep that in mind. So I want to ask, what is spirit? How can we think about it in a way that sort of makes sense? Right. So firstly, I think one way to sort of describe it is that spirit would be unobservable, right? You can't see it with the naked eye. However, we need something more to differentiate it because, like physicalists countenance unobservables all the time. They posit these, mind-independent entities. So we need a further criteria that will differentiate, let's say with from matter. And I think what that is agency, right? The spirit is not just unobservable, but it is an agent, right? With its own, set of abilities and goals. So I would want to affirm that spirit is real, right? And its theoretical role in an ontological scheme, right? We're just thinking about this in a technical sense, right? The spirit would be the principle of motion, right? This is, we can go back to Plato, who thought that, the psyche or the soul or the spirit is self-moving, right? Meaning that its source of motion is internal and not external, right? And so we can sort of see self-motion as describing something that is organic and lifelike, right? Whereas if the motion is external, then it's inert and it is machine-like, right? But so that's more to say on this later. So in the scientific revolution, right, we inherited a Cartesian grammar of motion, which soared as quantitative, linear, and purely external, right? You see motion as sort of displacement within space or displacement across space in a particular duration, right? And so, this again, this idea of motion, let's say would be contrary to a more Platonic scheme. And I just want to add that, Plato, I think, can be reconciled with physics, and Wolfgang Smith is actually a very able advocates in that, or I should say was, RIP. I mean, seeing motion as just like spatial displacement, exterior in an exteriority regime, there's a sort of Cartesian grammar that we inherited, right? This sort of way of seeing. And, for Bergson, seeing motion like this would be incurring a mistake, right? And the mistake is spatializing time. Alex Gomez-Marine, he said that one of Bergson's key insights his opinion or his idea, that time is not space, right? And if you look at Wolfgang Smith in his ontological scheme, he says the same thing, right? Time and space are separate, and in fact, for him, time takes primacy, right? And so, they aren't just differentiating space and time; they're also sort of giving time as priority. And so, they're obviously they disagree with Einstein. I mean, Bergson and Einstein had a whole, there was that great debate that they had in the 1920s, about this specific issue, right? And so, Chris Langen's Riaz. Well, before I even get onto that, if if you know Chris Langen, right, and you're aware of his work, chances are you think that he's like a sort of a crackpot who spouted off a bunch of meaningless technobabble, right? And his ideas are not to be taken seriously. Maybe you saw the Professor Dave video, or maybe even just before that. And I get it, I understand, but I would implore you to sort of look at the content of the argument and not the person who's proffering it, right? Let's just see how it stands on itself. All right, and so Chris Langen's reality principle basically states that there is nothing external to reality, right? If something is real enough to affect reality, it is therefore inside reality, and so there is no outside reality. And this is basically the same thing that Lee Smolin says, right? So Lee Smolin says, like, the first rule of cosmology is that there is nothing outside reality, right? They're saying the same thing there. And what does that mean? That means that necessarily reality's source of motion is internal, right? And again, if we link internal source of motion to, organisms or things that are lifelike, then we get again to the sort of Platonic sense where Plato did see the universe as its sort of a giant organism rather than an inert machine. And so that is interesting to think about, so that the spirit of reality would be its internal source of motion that propels it forward. Okay, let's continue on this train, motion and spirit, right? So let's sort of again go with the chain of associations that I'm trying to get here. Spirit is the principle of motion, right? And any entity which has its source of motion internal to itself is lifelike, and motion is related to time, right? So we got time, motion, life, and spirit. Then we're trying to, I know that's a bit of a loose amalgam, but let's just stick with it. And we're going to read an excerpt from Chris Langen's paper, and I'll link it in the description. And once again, content, not the person who's producing the idea. Okay, so here he's talking about space and time, and he's trying to show why space and time are sort of distinct, right? And how that works. Okay, so let's read. All right. Let's look at the problem more closely. The processing of one state into the next occurs between states, right? E.g., to produce state 2 of X from a prior state 1 of X, processing must occur between S1 and S2 in a processing or state transitional interval. But the processing interval, S1, S2, can have no duration and therefore must remain hidden, as otherwise there is a time lag during which X has no state at all and thus drops out of the display medium, right? And so this is basically saying that we only see states, right? And we see states changing, but we don't see the thing that's causing the state to change, right? The state transition interval, right? And because if we did see the state transitional interval, that would mean there'd be a moment where X has no state, right? Because in the state transit, you got, X has state 1, and then you got the state transition, and that carries it to S2. But if the state transition, had any duration and you could see it, that means that there would be no display, right? As X couldn't sort of be displaying S1 and S2 at the same time. So let's carry on. Thus, what gets displayed in real time are instantaneous state transition events coinciding with the states themselves in the display. Real time becomes discontinuous if the transition of one state into a successive state coincides with the display of a single state. Thus, processing and display are necessary distinct functions and must alternate. The display must therefore be stratified with focus between a hidden processing layer and a visible display layer. In other words, avoiding perceptual or observational disruption requires that processing be hidden so as not to occasion discontinuities between displayed states. But this contradicts the supposition that the display has both processing and display functionality. To put it as succinctly as possible, processing is not displayed. Right? This is important. This is basically just sort of reaffirming what Bergson said, and just I think giving maybe a more technical argument. Although I haven't read a lot of Bergson, so don't hold me to that. But what he's trying to convey here is that time and space, right? Time is processing and space is display. They cannot coincide, right? And therefore you must have a hidden processing layer and a visible display layer. And this is, the same thing as Bergson saying, do not spatialize time. And so if we follow that thread, right, that means that the processing domain, which is a time domain, right, which you can see as a domain of motion, is a domain of spirit, right? It's a domain that is hidden and isn't displayed. But you'll give a more concrete example in the next slide. So one way to think about this is that every observable line is circumscribed by an unobservable circle, right? So you can even think about this in your lifeline. Your birth to your death isn't just a line, right? That line was drawn by a circle that you can't see, and that's that circle is your in the scheme I'm trying to provide here. It's spirit, and so we can see all motion as emotion, right? And this again, we need to bring back the bifurcation of nature, right? It might feel unnatural to sort of attach motion, which we typically see as like res extensa, right? Motion is out there, like a source is out there, and emotion is inside here. But again, if we buy Whitehead's bifurcation of nature, where he says that this is a mistake, right? Fissioning apart interior entities from exterior ones. And so in order to heal that bifurcation, we need to stitch these things back together, right? Which is stitching motion and emotion. So, it might feel or sound unnatural, but if we think about it like a stitch, like if we're gonna use a stitch to close up a wound, it's not gonna exactly be comfortable. And I guess in this analogy, we don't have any anesthetic. So yeah. Okay, that was all a bit abstract. So let's try and concretize it and bring it to bear on something that is sort of more easily graspable, right? So let's say that we have a sentence, right? And so first word is the, and that's state one, right? The second word is cat, and that's state two. The arrow is the state transition between state one and state two, right? So just as you're saying, the arrow is state transitional or processing or time, right? And the words are the display elements. Those are the things within space, right? And yeah, there you go. So that's a state transition function, right? Between the word the and the word cat. And so once again, that's processing. Third word is jumped, right? And we can say that is state three. And again, between state two and state three, we have a state transition, right? A processing. State two to state three. Okay, so note how we can only observe the sentence, the cat's jumped, but we cannot see the state transitions between, right? So when you're like reading a book or a story, all you're seeing is words. you aren't seeing the state transition that transforms state 1 to state 2 to state 3. That's basically what Langan was trying to show, right? That this processing necessarily is hidden. It is not displayed. And so if you think about the words of the sentence as bodies and the things that are processing the states as spirits, right, in the processing domain or in a state transitional domain, notice that these things are hidden, right, which goes back to our spirits being unobservable, although they also need to be agentic or be agents, and so that's, haven't sort of brought that in, but just keep that in mind. Right, so think about each object in your panorama right now, right, as a state. Right, you have different objects in your room, like I can see like a lamp, a laptop, a TV, a pot, and a book. Each of those things are states. We can either state 1, state 2, whatever. When those states change, right, we see something move from here to here, we see it change color or whatever, that state transition is a spirit, right? But again, processing is not displayed. The spirit is not body, right? Time is not space. So keep that in. Processing is not displayed. Time is not space, right? This was Bergson's key idea, and I think the way that Langan sort of phrased it is very helpful in understanding this. Okay, and now we're going to be looking at the spirit less technically and a bit more mythopoetically. Right? We'll look at it in a mythological sense and a more poetic sense, using mythology in the way, Peterson / Jung / Viveki would use it in terms of, it not just being decorative description, but sort of capturing cross-generational persistent patterns. Okay. So in the mythopoetic sense, we can see spirits as the breath or the wind, right? It's the wind and our breathing are both very motion-centric things, and they're also invisible, right? You can't see the breath, you can't see the wind, and so it maps on, in a sort of archetypal sense, onto the breath and the wind quite well, I think. To look at these things, mythopoetically is also sort of affirming the dream analogy from earlier, where so you look at things symbolically, not literally, right? And that's sort of what we're still trying to emphasize right now. Right, we can see in the Bible that the Holy Spirit was described like a dove, right, which again brings to mind, right, the sky, the wind, motion, and in fact, birds are also very common sort of imagistic tools used when thinking about spirit, right? And so if we think about this sort of, again, in a more poetic way, and we're thinking about the creation of the universe, there is this common through line through a number of different cultures, right, of how reality began. And it starts with a primordial ocean, right? It's just like ancient, timeless ocean that suffuses everything. It's kind of all encompassing. The Egyptians had Nu, right? That was their sort of a name for this watery chaos. That was primordial watery chaos. The Sumerians had Apsu, and the Hebrews, had Tehom, which is interesting because that's what's used in Genesis, right? And it's interesting that the ocean is the image used here because, again, it's like the ocean is boundless, right? If you think about it from the perspective of our ancestors, right? They're looking at the ocean and this thing is boundless. It just goes on forever, right? And this boundless or unboundedness brings you back to the no-thingness, right, of Viveki and Nishitani. Right, a thing is bounded, a no thing is unbounded, and so you can see that the no thing here is analogous to the ocean, which is boundless and all-encompassing. Can also think about it like Plato's Kora, which again is the receptacle of being. So, with this framework, we can sort of look at the Genesis creation myth again, anew. Right, and so verse 2 says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the waters." So a couple of interesting things here, right? Without form and void. Again, that's talking about something that is boundless or unbounded, right? The no thing, right? And darkness was upon the deep. they translated Tehom to deep, and Tehom is sort of meaning the same primordial in Hebrew anyway, meaning the sort of primordial watery chaos, right? So darkness was upon the face of Tehom, of this primordial ocean, and the Spirit of God moved upon the waters, right? Notice how the Spirit again is being tied in with motion, right? And it is being tied in with activity. And so it's the Spirit of the God moving upon these primordial waters that sort of was the impetus for these things. And I think that's very interesting to think about it like that. And so we can sort of play with this Trinity a bit more. You know, this was Rupert Sheldrake who kind of put me onto this, onto these parallels between the Christian Holy Trinity and the Hindu Trimurti, right? So in the Christian Holy Trinity, we have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? And so we can see the Father as the primordial ocean, right? We can see the Son as the Logos, or the what bestows pattern and order, you know, upon the movements. And then the Holy Spirit, right, we can see as the wind rippling the surface of these primordial oceans, right? Father is the primordial ocean, Son is the patterned order, and the Holy Spirit is the principle of activity. It's what gives the whole thing activity. Now, the Trimurti, what we have is, you know, Brahman, Vishnu, and Krishna, right? And so Brahman would be the father, if we're comparing it to Christianity, which would be, again, you know, the primordial ocean. Vishnu would be the son, right? Which again we'll compare to patterned order. So Vishnu is son, is patterned order, and Krishna is, again, you know, creation and destruction. This is what activates, gives the pattern. So Krishna would be the Holy Spirit. And it's interesting that these two faiths sort of happened upon these triadic structures, right? And sort of happened upon very similar ways of construing it all. There's this artist Sampha, and he's great. He released this album Lahai a couple years ago, and really great. It took me a while to sort of, you know, settle into it, but beautiful album. And he spoke a lot in the album, like if you think about thematic through lines, about spirit, you know, about sky, about clouds, and about birds. And, you know, I don't think that that's coincidence. I think the fact that those images sort of coalesced and organized that way for him in the album is showing that, you know, creativity is an epistemic organ, right? He's using his creativity to disclose something about the nature of spirit. And, you know, if we, that sort of relates also back to John Vervaeke's 4 Ps, right? Because remember, I had a overly narrow conception of knowledge, which was just propositional. John Vervaeke sort of opened me to the other modes of knowing, right? The procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory. And now we can see this as sort of a further expanding of what, you know, knowledge could be, right? And so someone who's making an album, who's making music, is also sort of producing knowledge. And, you know, if we look at the cover of the album, right, it's the sky and clouds, and, you know, that's very sort of serendipitous for the sort of picture that I am trying to paint here, right? And this is also why my logo is the sky and the clouds, right? Because I was always a kid whose head in the clouds, and so it's spirit, right? And that's sort of what I'm trying to convey with ideation. Another way, right, in which things sort of changed, which is linked to the sort of quality foundationalism, is to understand things like intuition, imagination, emotions, and whatnot as genuine epistemic organs which disclose salient aspects of the world, right? And this is contrary to the sort of the scientific revolution, which, you know, sort of saw these epistemic tools like intuition, imagination as rather soft, right? And so it's experimentation and reason that is most lofted high above. And experimentation and reason are extremely important, and it's a major, I think, discovery, because that's sort of what gave science its power, right? And how it's become so central to the modern way of living. But I would just want to, on top of that, sort of affirm how things like, I mean, reason and experimentation are actually still kind of based on creativity, intuition, imagination, right? It's just a bit more of a more rigorous sense. And so I'd want to affirm that. And yeah, this is again like quality foundationalism, right? You take seriously phenomenology as a raw material, whereas before it was just seen as like an optical phenomenon or something you have to bypass or climb over in order to get to the truth, right? Which is sort of mind independent and completely independent of all experiences. And so you have to control for these things and push them to the side, whereas my new perspective sort of takes them as the raw material for metaphysical speculation. And Brenton Rahm, who I think we read a quote sort of earlier, he put this succinctly well in his paper on panpsychist idealism, and so we'll read from there. Right, so this is Brenton Rahm. The motivation of this article is hence to provide phenomenological arguments for idealism. The approach uses phenomenology as a guide to metaphysics in combination with taking seriously the findings of the sciences. Such an approach, which can be referred to as an analytic phenomenology, is beginning to be defended and taken up by some philosophers. In my view, this science-inspired approach, which takes seriously our phenomenological data, is one of the surest methods for avoiding the possibility that when we do metaphysics, we are merely playing games with words. And I just want to sort of pause and linger on that for a bit. It's very interesting because, people who are sort of more naturalistically oriented and view metaphysics with suspicion, right? They tend to see experience, right, more as like an obstacle to the truth that you have to control for and get past. But here, Brenton Rahm is saying taking it seriously is actually what will prevent us from, the charge of metaphysics being merely conceptual word games, right? It's what keeps us on firm footing. Okay, let's continue. So, why use phenomenology as a guide to metaphysics? Since first-person experience is a basic form of evidence, we don't need to justify the assumption that experience can show the nature of the world. Beginning with the way things are given is simply more scientific than ignoring the evidence or dismissing it. The assumption is not that this evidence is infallible, but that it provides prima facie defeasible justification for metaphysical claims. The burden of proof, I claim, is on the objector who wants to disregard the first-person evidence. So yeah, that's quite interesting. And I liked what he said about phenomenology not being infallible, right? Because we can be wrong about things that we're introspecting upon, and we can make all sorts of mistakes. And so we wouldn't want to treat our first-person experience as if it's just as if it's without error. And so we need to do an analytic phenomenology, right? And what would that look like? Well, the way I'm sort of thinking about it now is, what I said earlier, all metaphysics are just elaborations of intuitions. And so, there's Amanda Gefter who said something that I found quite interesting. And she said, I think this was an interview with Kurt. She's a great, very cogent thinker, that what is real is what is most invariant, right? And so if we're looking at analytic phenomenology, we're trying to find out what are the most invariant aspects of our experience that we can use then to existentially generalize to the rest of the world, right? And so if we take, for example, let's try and look, which segment of our experiences, we try and look at our external domain, right? The world, again, of tables, chairs, and mountains. Is that invariant? Well, you close your eyes and it's gone, right? So we can sort of strike that off the table. And if we sort of elaborate and go on this, we'll actually find out that what is invariant across all of our experiences, right? What is the most invariant aspect of our experience that we have? It would be this raw generic awareness, right? Kastrop always uses this example. If you were in a sensory deprivation chamber, right, and you had complete amnesia, so you weren't even really recording memories, you would still have this raw subjectivity, this I. And because that is what is most invariant, that is what we should existentially generalize, right? And that's how you sort of get things like a cosmic subject. And so I think that's sort of an example of how analytic phenomenology would work. And so we're gonna We're going to look at another quote here. This is on, I saw this on a paper by Matt Siegel. And the paper is Physics Within the Bounds of Feeling Alone, which, interesting title, very salient to what we're discussing here. And I saw this quote because, Siegel's he's a Whiteheadian, broadly speaking, although he is not like chained to it, so to say. But okay, let's read this Whitehead quote. The primitive form of physical experience is emotional, blind emotion, received as felt elsewhere in another occasion and conformally appropriated as a subjective passion in its relevance to a world beyond, though the relevance is vague. In the phraseology of physics, the primitive experience is vector feeling, that is to say, feeling from a beyond which is determinate and pointing to a beyond which is to be determined. And, this is really interesting, the fact that he sort of blended a word that's sort of native to physics and maths, vector, right, and one that's emotion, vector feeling. This is again, an example of trying to heal the bifurcation, right? This move only makes sense if you agree with that the bifurcation of nature was a mistake and we need to find ways to heal it. And so this is just another example of how we can sort of take phenomenology seriously and, sort of start seeing forces as vector feelings. Right. And another way that we could go about this, which is again quite speculative, but just note again that it is motivated by trying to heal the bifurcation of nature. Okay, so and it's about bosons, right? So we can think about, bosons are force carriers, which have integer spin, right? You have things like photons and gluons, and they do not obey the Pauli exclusion principle, like fermions do. Fermions are typically considered as like the constituents of ordinary matter as we sort of typically think about it. Right, and so the Pauli exclusion principle, we can sort of think about that as an impenetrability thesis, right? Because materialism in the 17th century had these properties that matter has, and one of them was impenetrability. You can see the Pauli exclusion principle as sort of an elaboration, on that, which is to say that, fermions, different fermions cannot inhabit the same quantum state. But bosons, right, bosons can share the same quantum state. And so, it's, if we're going to try and sort of use that in an analytic phenomenology sense, we can see how, consider earlier when I was talking about dual aspect monism, and we needed to motivate why you choose dual aspect monism. And so, one of the motivations is like, why do our interior worlds, thoughts and emotions, present so differently than to the external world? External world is more public, the internal one doesn't seem to be as much. And so we need to explain this, right? It's something that requires an explanation. And so I sort of cited Bohm's implicate order, and this is sort of like a non-spatial order where things are enfolded upon one another. Bohm uses that word, enfolded upon. And so I think we can see enfolded upon as being bosons occupying the same quantum state, right? And this is sort of the speculative leap, right? So if you think about emotions, right, you can feel excited and anxious at the same time, right? You can think of the anxiety and the excitement as inhabiting the same state, right? And so if we think about emotions in a sort of bosonic sense where they can occupy the same states, then, it's interesting. And, again, this might sort of feel unnatural, right? Might seem like a philosopher untrained in quantum mechanics, right? A clumsy interloper. As if you watch Succession, that's what Carl said to Tom, called him a clumsy interloper, which is funny. But, sort of clumsily going into this thing and making sort of wild speculations. But yeah, I'll once again reiterate that this is from the perspective of trying to heal the bifurcation of nature, right? And sort of stitch together the interior and the exterior instead of, the Cartesian grammar where they are seen as separate. And, I'll link a video. Julia Mossbridge had something to say about this, very interesting. And another channel, Teleodynamics. He also mentioned, I couldn't find the specific video, but, these are the two thinkers who have sort of pointed to bosons as a very interesting doorway into thinking about some of these other things. And I'll link the channel, Teleodynamics, and the Julia Mossbridge interview where she speaks about bosons and consciousness specifically. Right. So, these vector feelings, this is how we heal the bifurcation of nature. And, I think I use the metaphor, stitching together without anesthetic, right? You stitch a wound without anesthetic, it's going to feel painful and sore. Okay. And let us continue. This was me sort of finalizing, how my beliefs have changed from when I was an atheist materialist to where I am now. So, I am now more prone to think that there is some form of afterlife or beyond, because if you're a non-physicalist in any stripe, then, the mind is not bound within the circumference of the skull, right? And, if you're physicalist, the mind is sort of bounded within the circumference of the skull, and therefore, notion of an afterlife doesn't really even make sense, right? And it doesn't see how it could be possible. And actually, it's funny because I remember I was talking with a friend about this a couple of years ago, and they were Muslim, and we were talking about death. And so they asked me what I think, happens when you die. And I said, I think it's just sort of infinite nothingness. And then I asked them, what they thought. And they said that in their faith, basically, your soul gets weighed on a scale, right? And if I think that it's measured against a feather or something like that. And if your soul is heavier than the feather, then, you sort of lived a life that's heavy with sin, so to speak. And if it's lighter, then you did well. And yeah, it's funny now because I think I'm actually more prone to seeing that as somewhat true. So yeah, I'll link some videos below regarding this. One from the Nature of Reality channel, which is, just sort of going over a couple of studies of near-death experiences and showing how they might indicate something of an afterlife. And then I'll link a Formskin video about death, and the afterlife. My video is a lot more sort of speculative, but it is broadly aligned with sort of how I'm seeing things. And so, I think if we want to understand what death is like, right, what the afterlife will be like, then sleep and dream states are our best clues as to what death is, right? It was Nas who said, sleep is the cousin of death, right? And that's an old myth, like sleep is the brother of death, like sleep and death have always sort of been related. And so I think that gives us our best clues to what death is. And so I'll read an excerpt from this paper by Gregory Shushan on near-death experiences. And here he's sort of citing a Welsh philosopher, old Welsh philosopher called H. Price, who had the theory of afterlife, which is relevant to what I think. Okay, so let's go. So let's read. The model best suited to address the problem remains that of the Welsh philosopher H. Price. He posited a world of mental images, a mind-dependent reality that to the disembodied spirit would seem as real as life on earth, including the impression of having a physical presence and use of the bodily senses. Indeed, it might be so similar that individuals would have considerable difficulty in realizing they were dead, a theme reflected in some NDE accounts. Disembodied spirits would appear to each other as telepathic apparitions and communicate telepathically. Furthermore, like-minded individuals who share, for example, similar memories, ideas, values, or culture would collectively create their surroundings, with each soul contributing to the group afterlife, while also bringing personal, idiosyncratic features into being. The result would effectively be numerous different dream worlds. The way they manifest would be determined by the co-creator's memories and desires, meaning that a person's cultural background and individual psychology would manifest within the experience. The barriers between the conscious and unconscious mind might dissolve, leading to experiences created by states of the mind, both positive, love, harmony, fulfillment, and negative, guilt, fear, and anger. Right, and these correspond to the NDE theme of the evaluation of one's earthly life, which is sort of a life report. It's the reports of distressing NDEs, and I think that links back to the weighing the soul on the scale, right? Which is a sort of belief in Islam. At least I was told about what happens during the afterlife, and so yeah. And I thought I'd sort of end this, on a bit of more of a skeptical note to see some sort of potential pushbacks that could be given against, ideas like this. I think it's important to sort of try and introspect into the psychological motivations that could prejudice you to certain positions, right? And so if someone's sort of coming from a skeptical angle, they'll sort of see it like this, right? So yeah, woo-philiacs, which is a sort of my little neologism, people lovers of woo. The claim would be that these magical beliefs in like death and the soul and telepathy, things like that, are just beliefs used to terror manage, right? And terror management is a psychological thesis that was proposed to say that we have magical beliefs due to our terror of death. We're using those to manage death. And it's like Billy Wood said, great rapper, life is short, who am I to judge how you terror manage? Three-line on the court and my kid. Nah. I just rap the whole verse. Nah. But so could definitely say that people who are woo-phobic, fear of woo, that's sort of pushback they might give, which is that these beliefs are just kind of used as a cope with the looming terror of death, which is linked to like me and I speak more when I was 10 years old and had severe death anxiety, which has been more or less sort of a lifelong thing. Right. So with the Enlightenment came the disenchantment of the world, right? The world sort of, wasn't populated by angels or spirits, it just became the sort of inert, dead machine. And if you have a romantic, poetic temperament like I do, sort of more creative temperaments, like aesthetically, this is just displeasing, right? And so this sort of romanticist reaction against the Enlightenment could be, platforming a lot of the arguments against it, right? And the romantic period basically was it emphasized the individual, the subjective, the irrational, the imaginative, personal, spontaneous, the emotional, right? All of these things would have sort of given more emphasis in a romantic view. But yeah, it's like we want it to be true, right? So we think that it's it would be nice if it was true, and so find motivations to believe so, but I think physicalism can be psychologized too, as all positions can, right? I'll link a paper by Bernardo Castro which tries to go into this, which is sort of going into the psychological motivations for physicalism. And the paper isn't saying that physicalism is wrong. Like, that's not what the paper is about in the scope of that paper. It's just giving potential psychological motivations. He talks about things like fluid compensation, all of those things, right? But yeah, I just like to end this with, my attitude only is like, who really knows, right? Like Bernardo Castro says, these are just our best guesses, and these are my best guesses as they currently stand. But yeah, that's all we have. We can't really buy certainty with this. So yeah. Okay, and thank you for listening. This is a bit of a long video, but I hope you found it interesting. Could give it a like and a subscribe if you did, and if you didn't, again, just be a good Samaritan. It doesn't cost anything to be nice, as they say. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Life is short, who am I to judge how you terror manage? No tree line on the court and my kicks is canvas. To put it on loudspeakers, the only reason I flew to Los Angeles. Chengdu's taste, cross town midday, I defy the establishment.